This is a lecture video of the muscular system. We're going to look at the different types of muscle, talk about general structure of skeletal muscle, and then look at how our muscles are named. So moving on, looking at basic functions of the muscular system. When we look at the muscles working together with the skeleton, movement is the number one function of the muscular system. And it's not always just movement of the body in terms of, riding a bike or lifting a book off of a table, but it's movement of materials within the body. For example, our smooth muscle that lines our blood vessels and the digestive tract, those and the urinary tract, those are important for moving fluids throughout the body. So blood, urine, food in the digestive tract, that's movement of materials, which is also a responsibility of the muscular system. And the contraction of the heart and setting forth, flow of blood through the body and blood pressure, that is cardiac muscle, another type of muscle. And we'll talk about the three different types of muscle. So looking at those three groups, then we have smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and skeletal muscle. Each individual cell within these muscle types is called a muscle fiber. And the reason why we call them a fiber is they're not a typical round cell. They're actually long and thin. They differ a little bit from one another. We'll look at that in the next slide here. But it's important to understand that a fiber is another name for a muscle cell. So looking at some pictures from your textbook, there's a nice picture here, figure 13.1, that shows the three different types of muscle. So skeletal muscle is the type of muscle that attaches to our bones. So its function is voluntary movement. So this is what we have control over. When we want to move our body, we simply think about it, and that sends an impulse from the brain to the muscle via what's called the motor neuron, and that muscle can contract and relax, as we want it to. So that's called skeletal muscle. Skeletal muscle is unique. It's long cylindrical cells, so they're long cylinders, kind of like the tubing coming out of the back of your dryer. And it has these lines on them due to the proteins that make up skeletal muscle. They're very evenly arranged, and we call these stripes, these vertical lines, we call those striations. So these striations are due to the proteins actin and myosin that make up skeletal muscle in a very regular repeating pattern, and it gives it that striped look. We also see that skeletal muscle has multiple nuclei per cell. So here's one muscle cell, and we can see there's a nucleus here and a nucleus here. And again, all these striations, these vertical lines. So that is unique to skeletal muscle. And the function of skeletal muscle is movement of the bones, and it's under voluntary control, which means we control the movement of those muscles. The only exception to that would be the diaphragm. The diaphragm is a skeletal muscle, but it's not under voluntary control. It's controlled by the brainstem, by the medulla, and it contracts and relaxes for breathing. Smooth muscle is not under voluntary control. It lines our blood vessels and the walls of the digestive tract and the ureters and the bladder. So this is smooth muscle. Smooth muscle does not have striations. You'll see it's smooth. That's where it gets its name, smooth muscle. It does not have the striations. And the cells are kind of fat in the middle and tapered on the end. So we say that the cells are spindle shaped. They're narrow at the end and wide in the middle, and they typically have just one nucleus per cell. So we can see these are individual cells with one large nucleus near the center. That's typical of smooth muscle. And sometimes these are found in layers or sheets, particularly in the digestive tract, in the stomach. And they are, again, under involuntary control. Their job is to move fluid throughout the body, whether it be blood, food, urine. That is the job of smooth muscle. Cardiac muscle is unique in that it has branched cells. So the cells would start, for example, let's find a good one to look at. Okay, so here's a cardiac muscle cell, and it is tethered together with another cardiac muscle cell with this dark line here called an intercalated disc. So the cells are branched, which here, let's look at this one. We can see here's a cardiac muscle cell coming down like this, and then it also comes this way. So it's kind of like a V shape here. And this is a nucleus, again, single nucleus per cell, but the cells are branched and they're connected to one another with these dark little structures called intercalated discs. So what that basically means is that when one muscle is contracting, it's pulling the other muscle cells with it, and the impulse can spread from one muscle cell to another muscle cell, because the intercalated discs not only tether the different muscle cells together, holding them together, but it also serves as a doorway for ions to flow through and for the impulse to reach the entire portion of that muscle cell. For example, when the atria contract at the top of the heart here, this is lined with cardiac muscle. When those two are stimulated to contract, they contract as a unit. The same thing with the ventricles, the right and left ventricle. When these cells are stimulated to contract, they contract as a unit. And that allows that heart to really effectively pump blood, either from the atria to the ventricles or from the ventricles out the arteries to the rest of the body. So it's really important that these intercalated discs help them to function together as a complete unit for efficient contraction and moving of blood. So cardiac muscle, it is branched. You'll notice it has striations just like skeletal muscle. It has these vertical lines going up and down, so it has that repeating regular pattern of actin and myosin, and giving that those striations. It's similar to smooth muscle in that it has one nucleus per cell, and it's also under involuntary control. So key things to kind of keep these three different types of muscle cells straight is remember that smooth and cardiac are involuntary. Skeletal is the only one that is voluntary and attached to bones. Skeletal and cardiac are both striated, and smooth and cardiac have one nucleus per cell, where skeletal muscle has multiple nuclei per cell. All right, moving on then. Going back to our slides here. So we talked about smooth muscle, talked about that it's involuntary. Now the interesting thing about smooth muscle as well is that it takes a little longer for smooth muscle to contract, but it can contract for a long time without getting tired and needing to relax, unlike our biceps and our quadriceps and the muscles that are attached to our bones. Smooth muscle can contract for a long time and does not get tired. And a perfect example of that, for those of you that have ever had a child and given birth, we know that the strong smooth muscle contractions of the uterus during childbirth are very intense, and they can last a long time before they slowly ease off. And they're very productive in the fact that they can send a baby through a small opening during childbirth. So smooth muscle, is definitely not one to be underestimated in terms of its strength, because it is a powerful muscle that can hold its contraction much longer than skeletal muscle. So cardiac muscle, we already talked about those intercalated discs. So they interlock those cells together, and they also have those special doorways. They're called gap junctions that allow the ions to spread from cell to cell, like sodium, potassium, calcium, and that allows that contraction to go from cell to cell to cell very quickly, so the heart contracts as a unit, the ventricles together, the atria together. So looking at cardiac muscle, we know that it relaxes between heartbeats, so or I should say between contractions, which is kind of obvious. Anyway, we'll get into, we already talked about the cardiac muscle in terms of the heart sounds and the lubbed up and all that at the beginning of the semester. But just remember that, during systole, that's when the heart muscle is contracting, and diastole is when the heart muscle is relaxing, and that's what causes those pressure waves to get the blood to move from the heart to the tissues of the body. And that's important that we have this constant cycling from relaxation, contraction, relaxation. And again, it's involuntary, and it can contract without a nervous system stimulus. So some of the muscle cells in the heart that make up the SA node, AV node, we talked about that with the cardiac system in the beginning of the semester, they can generate their own impulse. So we can take the heart out of the body, transplant it to a new person, and that heart will contract all on its own without nervous system input. So we talked about skeletal muscle again, voluntary controlled, very long in length. If you look at some of the muscles like the sartorius that attaches to the outside of the hip and to the inside of the knee, that's a long bundle of muscle fibers, going from that distance. That can be, up to 3 feet long in a person that's quite tall. So we looked at the striations, the multiple nuclei. Looking at, for example, just the human body, we talked about skeletal muscles are attached to bones, and when they contract, they move those bones at the joints. So where the bones connect are joints, and that's where we see that movement, depending on the type of joint. So skeletal muscles are very important for support. It allows us to remain upright and not just be a pile of mush on the floor. So the bones obviously provide structure to our body, but the muscles and the contraction of those muscles hold us upright. And when we voluntarily relax certain muscles, that allows us to sit versus lie down versus standing. So another important thing that not everybody may realize is that your body temperature of 98.6 is essentially the result of waste heat that is given off with skeletal muscle contraction. And I'm sure you've recognized that when you start to move a little more, start to exercise or just move your muscles a little more, that you get quite warm and your body temperature raises to the point of sweating if you're really working hard with your muscles. And that's a result, again, of that energy being released to the environment as the muscle cells are using ATP and giving off waste heat. So I had a relative one time ask me, how can he stay out hunting in, 10-degree Fahrenheit weather and he's nice and warm? And I said that's, skeletal muscle contraction and the heat being given off, the waste heat being given off as the skeletal muscles are, slightly contracted in maintaining his body position. So we really have to give a lot of credit to those skeletal muscles for maintaining our body temperature. And we know as the body temperature goes down, the skeletal muscles respond by contracting quickly in short little contractions, which we know as shivering. So shivering raises body temperature. And we know that sweating lowers body temperature, so that has more to do with the sweat glands in the skin, but we can raise our body temperature by shivering and just more muscle contraction. So when we look at other functions of the skeletal muscles, when the skeletal muscles contract, it helps move the blood through our veins and through our lymph vessels. So, it's important that we walk around and not allow people to sit all day, because that can lead to blood clots, because they're not, the blood in the veins is pooling in the legs, especially when you're flying in an airplane and the pressure is a little lower up there. It's important to get up and walk around the room. And it's also important for our lymphatics, the vessels that run alongside of our arteries and veins that kind of clear out the debris in our tissues and keep us healthy and prevent swelling in our feet and ankles. So good muscle contraction is important for that as well. People find that they get sick less when they're exercising, and we know that just good movement of lymph is important in fighting infection and keeping us healthy. So even just simple walking 20 minutes a day is important for good blood flow, keeping our muscles moving, keeping our joints fluid, and also moving fluid through our lymphatic system. As those skeletal muscles squeeze against the walls of the lymphatics, it promotes the movement of lymph throughout the body. And some muscles, line our body cavities. For example, the abdomen doesn't have any bone to protect it, but those abdominal muscles, we have several layers of abdominal muscles to protect our internal organs. So very important function there in just protecting those delicate organs and stabilizing our joints. Some people find that their knees are bad and they have knee pain with activity, and oftentimes it's because their muscles are weak when they're trying to, say, go for a run or start a jogging routine. If the muscles are weak, they're not able to support the joint during running, and then the joint is unstable and it causes tissue breakdown within the joint. It's really very wise to strengthen the muscles before doing any kind of long distance or endurance activity that is weight bearing, because it's very damaging to joints, and especially for people that are overweight, 20 pounds or more overweight, that jump up and start to go jogging. It's not the best approach to start out. It's always best to strengthen, do a little bit of non-weight bearing strengthening activities, like maybe riding a bike or working on an elliptical, strengthening those muscles, and then moving into a simple jogging routine as the muscles strengthen and they start to lose a little bit of that weight. Because it can be discouraging for people that are trying to exercise when they suffer knee pain or knee injury or ankle or foot injuries because they worked on those joints too hard with excess weight. So when you look at how muscles work, they work in pairs in that when one muscle is contracting, the opposite muscle is relaxing. And a good example for that is when you flex your arm at the elbow. That's the biceps brachii shortening. So on the bottom of the arm is the triceps brachii. That has to lengthen in order to allow the arm to move in that direction. So when one muscle is contracting, it has an antagonist muscle on the opposite side of the body that will be relaxing to allow that movement. And then when we straighten our arm out, then that's the triceps contracting and the biceps brachii on top relaxing. So where a muscle attaches to a bone that's not moving, we call that the origin, and the insertion is the other side of where that muscle attaches to the bone that is moving. So when you look at the biceps brachii, for example, the origin would be at the top of the arm, the humerus, and the insertion would be down at the elbow where the radius and ulna are located. So again, we can see in the origin here for the biceps brachii, for example. We can see the origin is, I didn't even say that right, that the origin there, it looks like, is at the scapula, top of the scapula, and the insertion here is down at the radius. So here's where it starts. This is the non-moving part, and then the insertion is the moving part at the lower arm. So actions of skeletal muscles, sometimes we can name them according to action or shape or location. So for example, looking at the size, the gluteus, which is the muscle, the larger muscle of the buttocks, the larger muscle, gluteus maximus, and then above that is a smaller muscle called gluteus minimus. And when we look at other muscles in the body, the term vastus, vast means large, longus means long, and brevis means short. So some of these terms, they have Latin or Greek prefixes or roots, and they just indicate size. Some muscles are named by shape. The deltoid, which is at the top of your shoulder, that is a triangle-shaped muscle. It's wider at the top and narrow at the bottom, and the Greek letter delta is a triangle, so that's where the word deltoid comes from. The trapezius is a trapezoid-shaped muscle. It's on the back of our head and attaches to our shoulders and then again to the middle of our back. And then latissimus means wide, teres means round. You're not going to need to know all of these. I'm going to go through some of the major skeletal muscles of the body, which we'll talk about. Sometimes our muscles are named after their location. So the muscle on the front of your head that allows you to raise your eyebrows is called the frontalis. And again, telling us location, frontal bone, it's on the front of the head. Pectoralis is the chest, gluteus means buttock, brachii means arm. Looking at the direction of the fibers, if they're straight fibers that run up and down or side to side in the body, we call that rectus. Rectus means straight. If it runs in a circle, orbit or orbicularis is another term around the eye. And transverse means across, so it goes side to side in the body. Oblique means it runs at a diagonal in the body. So these are just some terms that we use for naming skeletal muscles. Sometimes we can look at where those muscles attach as far as which bone. There's a muscle in the neck called the Sternocleidomastoid Muscle. It attaches to the sternum. That's where sterno comes from. Clavicle, cleido, mastoid process, which is right behind the ear. So if you turn your head to the right or left and you put your hand behind your ear, you'll notice there's a muscle that runs across from your ear down to your clavicle, and that's the sternocleidomastoid muscle. The brachioradialis is in the arm, so we know that it attaches to the forearm, but starts in the upper arm, so brachioradialis. And then the number of attachments to bone. For example, the biceps brachii has 2 attachments, so that's why it's called the biceps. And the triceps brachii has 3 attachments. Quadriceps has 4 origins. So sometimes those terms just give us a little bit of information about either attachment, location, size, shape. All of these things are used to name skeletal muscles. Sometimes the action, if it extends the fingers, we call it an extensor. If it bends the joint closer to the body, then we call it a flexor. Masseter, to masticate, means to chew, to masticate. And then levator means to lift. So some of these terms tell us, what direction things are moving. So looking at the major skeletal muscles of the body, we'll talk about those in a little bit with a separate lab video. But let's talk now, kind of shift gears in our next video, looking at muscle fibers and how they contract.